They said grief makes you honest, but in my case, it made me famous. When people talk about loss, they talk about silence, as if it's peaceful. But real silence isn't peace. It's the sound of memory refusing to die. Her words were all I had left, black ink bleeding through old paper, the faint perfume of rain trapped between pages. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still smell her handwriting, a mix of cedarwood, dust, and the lavender oil she rubbed into her wrists before she wrote. I told myself I was preserving her, that I was keeping her alive through the written word. But what I was really doing, though I couldn't admit it yet, was stealing her silence. When the novel launched, people said it was devastatingly raw. They wrote that no man could have written such emotion unless he had lived through it himself. They were right, except it wasn't me who'd lived it. It was her. My wife, Claire. Now, every time a reader hands me a copy to sign, I trace her handwriting printed beneath mine. A single line from her diary turned into a quote they've memorized. The sky doesn't mourn. It just endures. My signature looks like an apology that never learned how to end. I used to believe words could save people. I built a life around that belief, teaching creative writing, telling students that truth was the oxygen of art. But I never told them that too much truth can also suffocate you. My name is Elliot Reese, 42 years old, novelist, husband, father, and eventually widower. Before all this, I taught at a small liberal arts college in Oregon. I wasn't famous, not even close. My students called me the kind of writer who publishes in journals no one reads but everyone respects. It was a small compliment, but I wore it like armor. Respect, not money. That was the currency of people who'd already accepted obscurity as their fate. Claire was different. She didn't chase publication or prestige. She wrote for herself. Small, intimate pages filled with fragments of thought, sketches of emotion. She had dozens of notebooks, one for every mood, stacked neatly on a shelf she called her quiet choir. She said they were private rehearsals of honesty. I loved that line so much I used it once in a lecture. She laughed when I told her, but that night I caught her tearing the page out of her notebook, as if to reclaim it from me. That was Claire. Always generous with her feelings, but protective of her words. And I, always hungry for both. When she died, the silence in the house became unbearable. Not empty, crowded. Every room still breathed her. The smell of her shampoo lingered on towels. Her mug, the one with the chipped rim she refused to replace, still sat beside the sink, the faint ring of dried tea like a fossil of routine. I couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't even sleep without reaching out to the cold side of the bed. Grief is physical that way. It's not sadness, it's static. A weight that hums just under your ribs. One night, searching for a sweater of hers, something that still smelled like her warmth, I found the box. Old, wooden, faintly perfumed with cedar. It was tucked behind a stack of winter scarves, wrapped in an old blue shawl she'd worn to our wedding rehearsal. I opened it like it might exhale. Inside were 6 diaries, bound in soft leather, the edges weathered, the paper trembling with time. Her handwriting looped and fragile, the same way her voice used to sound when she was about to cry but didn't want me to notice. I told myself I opened the first one to feel close to her. But what I really wanted was to hear something new, something only she'd left unsaid. Her words cut through the fog of grief like a lighthouse. She wrote with a clarity I'd never achieved. Her pain exact, her joy raw, her reflections unedited. She wrote about the smallness of days, the sound of coffee dripping, the way the light looked at 5 p.m. in winter. How sometimes she felt invisible next to me, the writer. Reading those pages felt like eavesdropping on our marriage from another universe, one where honesty wasn't negotiable. I told myself I was reading to understand, to heal, to connect. But there's a thin line between understanding and intrusion, and I crossed it the night I highlighted her sentences. It started innocently, underlining a phrase, circling a metaphor, copying down a thought I might teach in class one day. But the truth is, I was already rearranging her, editing her pain into beauty, turning her private confessions into art I could manage. I remember the exact moment I crossed from mourning into theft. It was 3 a.m. The house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge. I sat at my desk, the first diary open in front of me, her words glowing under the lamplight. And I typed the first sentence I'd written since her death. It wasn't mine. It was hers. The sky doesn't mourn. It just endures. I placed it at the start of a short story about grief and survival. It felt right, like she was speaking through me, like I was keeping her alive through language. The story was published in a small online magazine. No one questioned it. A few readers commented, "So haunting, so intimate. This writer understands loss like it's a native language." I should have stopped there, but intimacy, when rewarded, becomes addiction. My editor, Janine, called me a week later. "Elliot, whatever you've tapped into, don't stop. This is your breakthrough." Breakthrough. The word cracked open something inside me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt alive again. Needed, relevant, worthy. Claire had always been the quiet one, the soul behind the scenes. Now, through me, her voice was finally heard. I convinced myself she'd approve, that she'd want the world to feel what she felt, that I was her messenger, not her thief. But every messenger carries a lie, that the message is still theirs to deliver. When the idea for the novel came, a fictionalized retelling of our marriage built entirely from her diaries, I told myself it was a tribute, a resurrection in print. I changed names, places, even the tone of her reflections, but the sentences, the heart of them, stayed hers. The way he looks at me isn't love anymore. It's observation. That line became the centerpiece of the book. Critics called it the most honest depiction of modern marriage. They said I'd captured the anatomy of loss with surgical precision. Each review felt like a medal pinned to my guilt. My daughter, Nora, was 16 when the book came out. She didn't say much at first, just watched me with that mix of pride and suspicion teenagers wear like armor. She'd lost her mother, too. I thought the book might help her remember. I told her, "Your mom's spirit lives in these pages." She asked quietly, "Did she want it to?" I smiled instead of answering. That's how liars survive, with silence disguised as tenderness. From that moment on, the applause had already begun. Faint, distant, seductive. And I was stepping closer to the stage. Temptation doesn't arrive with fanfare. It slides in quietly, wearing the face of reason. It started with small readings, bookstores, libraries, college halls. 30 people here, 50 there. Each room smelled of paper and coffee and the quiet reverence people bring to grief. I'd stand beneath soft lights, the pages trembling in my hands, pretending my voice wasn't breaking from guilt. I told them the story was inspired by loss, that I'd written it as a way to heal. The words came easily, too easily. They leaned closer, hungry for the intimacy I'd stolen. Their eyes gleamed with the warmth people reserve for saints. And I, desperate for something resembling meaning, let them believe. Every question afterward felt like permission to continue. How did you capture the intimacy so perfectly? Was it cathartic? Did she know you'd write about her? That last one always felt like a blade. I'd smile, glance at the floor, and say softly, "In a way, yes." The room would go still, heavy with shared sadness. They thought my pause meant pain. It was really calculation. I'd learned that sincerity is a performance, and I was a natural. Applause followed like waves against stone. The first few times I resisted it. Then I began craving it. It's strange how guilt can coexist with gratification, how you can hate yourself in private and still crave validation in public. Soon, I wasn't just Elliot the widower. I was Elliot, the voice of healing. The man who wrote what others were too afraid to feel. Janine, my editor, called again. "Elliot, the book's catching fire," she said. "People see you as the conscience of modern grief. It's a movement. Let's keep it going." She used words like momentum, branding, connection. I nodded along, half listening, because deep down I already knew. Momentum doesn't care what it's built on. It only demands that it never stop. That night I dreamt of Claire. She was sitting at her desk, writing, her back to me. When I called her name, she didn't turn. The sound of her pen scratching paper was deafening. When she finally looked over her shoulder, her eyes were made of ink. I woke up gasping, the taste of iron on my tongue, as if I'd swallowed a word I wasn't meant to speak. The readings turned into interviews. The interviews turned into fame. The fame turned into myth. Everywhere I went, people quoted her words. My wife's private thoughts now tattooed on tote bags, printed on coffee mugs, shared in glittering fonts across social media. Love doesn't vanish, it just changes rooms. Stillness is just motion we haven't learned to see. Her language had become product, and I was the salesman. I told myself it was noble, that art requires sacrifice, and I'd already paid the price. But deep down, I knew I was borrowing from a grave I hadn't built. My students started treating me differently too. They looked at me with the kind of admiration that once embarrassed me. They called me Professor Reese, the voice of truth. But I stopped teaching truth long ago. I was teaching performance, the rhythm of pain, the architecture of confession, the illusion of authenticity. Sometimes after class, I'd catch a student staring at the book cover like it held an answer. I wanted to tell them it didn't, that it was made of theft disguised as love. But I couldn't. because lies rot faster when spoken aloud. Success arrived in pieces. Emails from editors, feature spreads in magazines, invitations to panels titled Writing from the Wound. Each time I told myself I was doing good, that Claire's words had become medicine for others, that grief had been transformed into generosity. But every time someone thanked me for my courage, I felt a tremor under my ribs, like the part of me that still belonged to her was trying to claw its way out. One night, I sat on the kitchen floor surrounded by the diaries, their leather covers soft under my fingers, their scent still faintly hers. Cedar, rain, and the ghost of ink. I told myself I'd open them just to remember. But that's how all my betrayals began, with tenderness as camouflage. I read her passages about me, some gentle, some sharp. He carries sadness like an heirloom, polished, displayed, inherited. I think he loves words more than people. Maybe that's what I fell for. The sound of meaning, not the man. I highlighted those lines too. At first, I thought I was documenting her brilliance. But then, without realizing, I began rewriting them, changing tense, cutting a word here, adding one there, polishing them into something I could publish. It felt like collaboration, a final duet between us. That's what I told myself. But collaboration requires consent, and hers had died with her. A month later, the publishing house sent me an offer, a hardcover reprint, international rights, translation into 6 languages. I stared at the contract while her diary lay open beside it, her handwriting glowing like an accusation under the lamp. My hand trembled as I signed. The pen inked my name beside words she never meant for anyone to see. The first royalty check arrived 2 months later. I remember the exact amount: $48,700. Enough to pay off debts, fix the leaking roof, and buy Nora a new car. I told myself I was using her words for good, but each dollar felt like blood money. Nora didn't want the car. She said, Mom wouldn't have wanted me to drive her sentences. Her choice of words cut deep, too poetic for her age. I realized she was starting to sound like her mother, and that terrified me. So I did what all cowards do. I buried myself in work. The novel's success became a rhythm. Flights, readings, signings, staged grief. I perfected the pauses, the sigh before reading a passage, the trembling smile that made audiences feel close to me. They didn't see a man unraveling. They saw a man reborn. At night, I began drinking. Not to forget, but to rehearse, to practice the right kind of sorrow for interviews. Each swallow burned like truth disguised as art. Then came the New Yorker feature, a profile titled The Language of Loss. They called me the poet who turned mourning into melody. I remember staring at the printed words, realizing how perfectly they summarized the lie. I hadn't turned mourning into melody. I'd turned theft into applause. Still, I clipped the article and framed it, because shame, when dressed properly, looks a lot like pride. By the time The Silent Sky hit the bestseller lists, I was everywhere. Bookstores displayed towers of my guilt. Talk shows called me authentic. Critics said my writing made pain feel beautiful. That word, beautiful, haunted me. Because real pain isn't beautiful. It's messy, repetitive, relentless. It doesn't glow, it decays. But no one wanted decay. They wanted catharsis. So I gave it to them, wrapped in Claire's sentences and my sincerity. The more people praised me, the less I recognized myself. Even my reflection began to look like a role I was playing. Elliot the widower. Elliot the prophet of pain. Elliot the man who endured. But behind all those titles was a thief, drunk on sympathy. One night, Janine called to congratulate me on winning a National Literary Award. She said, "You've given people permission to feel again." I thanked her, hung up, and threw up in the sink. Then came the dinner with Nora. She'd agreed to meet me after months of silence. We sat in a restaurant that served her mother's favorite dish, lemon risotto. I thought it might comfort her. It didn't. She ate quietly, barely looking up. When I tried to make small talk, she cut me off. "Dad," she said, her voice flat but shaking underneath. Mom didn't want her words published, did she? The fork slipped from my hand. I wanted to say no. I wanted to lie well enough to protect her. But my mouth betrayed me. "I thought it would help people," I whispered. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Then maybe you should have asked the one person it was supposed to help first." She left before dessert. Her plate was half finished. So was I. That night I went home, opened another of Claire's diaries, and for the first time I saw my own name not as memory, but as a scar. Temptation doesn't always whisper. Sometimes it roars, with applause. I used to think guilt would stop me, that it would catch up eventually, grab my throat and choke out the lie. But guilt is patient. It doesn't confront you, it waits. It sits in the corners of hotel rooms, in the space between claps, in the silence after someone calls you brilliant. That year I was everywhere. New York, Los Angeles, London, Paris. Bookstores filled with my face on glossy posters. Airports stalked my name beside paperbacks about heartbreak and hope. People said I'd change the way grief is written. But grief can't be changed, only imitated. And I had become its counterfeit. The first time I stepped onto a stage larger than a classroom, I nearly turned back. The light hit me like interrogation. Hundreds of people stared, holding copies of The Silent Sky. I could see the underlines through the paper, all the passages they'd circled, all the sentences that weren't mine. Janine had said, "Don't overthink it. They're here for the feeling, not the facts." She meant it as reassurance, but that's the problem with art. It can turn lies into comfort. I began to read aloud. "The sky doesn't mourn. It just endures." The crowd went still. It was as if someone had pressed pause on their breathing. I looked up and saw tears. Dozens, hundreds. They believed it was my pain, my clarity, my voice. And for one terrible, beautiful moment, I believed it too. The applause that followed was thunderous, a wall of sound so powerful it drowned out thought. My pulse synced with it, like I'd been given a new heartbeat. For the first time since Claire died, I didn't feel empty. I felt seen. That night in the hotel, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, still wearing the same black suit. The applause was still echoing somewhere in my chest. I turned on the tap and watched the water run until it was almost overflowing. Then, without thinking, I whispered into the mirror, "We did it." The reflection didn't answer. But for a second, I swore I saw her standing behind me. Faint, blurred, like a memory refusing to fade. After that, it became easy. Too easy. My gestures were rehearsed now. The quiet sigh, the lowered gaze, the half smile before I read a passage about despair. Audiences love vulnerability when it's symmetrical. They love a grief that knows when to pause for applause. At every signing, people would thank me. A widow clutching my book said, "Your words helped me forgive myself." A young man whispered, "You gave me permission to cry." An old professor told me, "This is literature at its purest, truth without artifice." I wanted to tell them the truth was the artifice, that I'd taken it from someone who no longer had the chance to defend it. But their eyes were full of faith, and I'd grown addicted to their belief. Success wasn't a drug, it was a mirror, and I couldn't stop looking. By then, my days had become a blur of travel and staged emotion. Morning interviews, afternoon flights, evening readings. Each hotel room identical to the last. Beige curtains, neutral paintings, the kind of furniture that forgets you the moment you leave. I'd unpack my suit, iron my shirt, line up the pens I used for autographs. Rituals of control, distractions from the chaos inside. Then I'd sit on the bed, scrolling through articles that called me authentic, raw, unfiltered. The words felt like someone else's eulogy. I told myself I deserved this, that Claire's words were finally where they belonged, in the world. But that was the lie I wrapped in ritual. Because the truth was uglier. I'd used her death as material, her silence as currency. When The Silent Sky hit #1, my publisher threw a party in Manhattan. Champagne, cameras, journalists, the works. They projected the book cover on a giant screen above the bar. My name in white against a pale blue sky. Claire's title, Claire's color palette. Even the font had been inspired by her handwritten notes. Janine toasted to me, to the man who turned grief into gold. Laughter, applause, flashbulbs. I remember holding the glass and staring at the bubbles rising inside. They looked like small ghosts trying to escape. I couldn't drink it, so I set it down and smiled, pretending to be the man they thought they were celebrating. Later, when I got back to my hotel room, there was a gift waiting. A crystal award shaped like a flame. The plaque read, "For giving us permission to feel." Under the engraved quote was another line, a line from the novel. "Love doesn't vanish, it just changes rooms." Her words, my name beneath them. And for a moment, I thought the glass was burning my hands. The next morning, my publisher offered me a deal. 2 books, $500,000. A sequel, they said, The Sky After Silence. The world wants to know how you've healed, they told me. Healed. The word sounded foreign, like something that belonged to other people. But I nodded anyway, because you don't turn away from $500,000, or from the illusion of redemption. That night, back in Oregon, I opened the cedar box again. The diaries were still there, still heavy with the scent of her perfume and the weight of what I'd done. I picked up the last one, the one bound in navy leather, the one I'd promised myself never to touch. Inside, her first line stopped me cold. If he ever publishes me, even by accident, I'll never forgive him. I closed the book. Then I opened it again. It's funny how the human mind can twist clarity into confusion when guilt needs an alibi. I told myself she didn't mean it literally, that she'd written it in anger, that she would have understood. She'd always wanted her words to matter, hadn't she? And now they did. I was just helping them reach the world. That's how liars survive. They rename the crime until it sounds noble. The new book came quickly, too quickly. I wrote in feverish bursts, night after night, cutting and pasting fragments from her diaries, rearranging them into something resembling fiction. I told myself I was creating art from pain. But pain doesn't need editing. It just needs to be left alone. Each morning, I woke with sentences still echoing in my head. Hers, not mine. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Her voice began to merge with mine, like ink bleeding into water. Sometimes I'd catch myself saying things the way she used to. Quiet, precise, unsparing. And each time I did, I felt less like her husband and more like her ghost. The book was finished in 6 weeks, a record. Janine called it divine flow. I called it theft on autopilot. But the publishers loved it, the critics adored it, and the world kept clapping. Nora didn't. By the time The Sky After Silence went into print, she was barely speaking to me. She'd moved out, gone to college early, saying she needed space. I knew what that meant. Space wasn't distance, it was survival. One afternoon, while cleaning my study, I found a photograph tucked between 2 books. It was of Claire and Nora in the garden, sunlight spilling over their faces. On the back, written in pencil, were the words, "You said words could save people. Maybe you meant yourself." I read it 3 times. Then I sat there, holding it until the paper bent under my grip. That night, I dreamed of Claire again. She was sitting at her desk, writing, the lamp glowing warm against her skin. When I looked closer, every word on the page was my name, written over and over until the ink tore the paper. When I woke, my hands were black with ink from a pen that had leaked overnight. A coincidence, maybe. Or a confession. At the launch for the sequel, reporters asked me what the new book meant. I told them it was about forgiveness. They clapped. They always clapped. But the sound of it had changed. It no longer felt like validation. It felt like shovels, each cheer burying me deeper under the weight of what I'd done. The applause had become my punishment. Loud enough to drown out her voice, but never loud enough to quiet my own. Fame doesn't collapse in one loud crash. It unravels, thread by thread, until you realize you're naked in a room full of people who used to love you. After the sequel's release, my life turned into a carousel of microphones, camera flashes, and signatures. Cities blurred together. Chicago, Austin, Seattle, Dublin. I used to measure time by sunrise. Now I measured it by applause. Every question sounded rehearsed, every answer a variation of the same lie. I had become fluent in sincerity. And then came Lydia. She was a literary journalist from Boston. Sharp eyes, calm voice, the kind that could listen without interrupting. She interviewed me for a feature titled the poet of pain. Afterward, she said softly, "Would you like to grab dinner? You look like someone who hasn't eaten something real in a while." I said yes. That was the first real word I'd spoken in months. She reminded me of Claire in ways that terrified me. Not her face, not even her voice, but her stillness. The way she noticed things I didn't want noticed. Over wine, she told me how my writing had helped her survive her divorce. "You made grief sound bearable," she said. I should have told her the truth, that it wasn't mine to make bearable. Instead, I smiled and said, "Maybe we both needed the same thing." It started as empathy. Two wounded people orbiting the same absence. But loneliness is a seductive translator. It turns need into touch before you realize the syntax has changed. We began seeing each other between tours, New York, Toronto, Paris. She told me I deserved happiness. I almost laughed. Happiness? That was for people who hadn't built their success on someone else's grave. But in her arms, the noise stopped. For the first time in years, the applause went quiet. One morning, in a hotel in Berlin, I woke before her. The curtains were half drawn, light spilling in like diluted gold. On the nightstand, her phone buzzed, a notification lighting up the screen. My own face stared back from the wallpaper, beside a quote in elegant cursive. "When I die, I hope someone loves me enough to keep me unfinished." Claire's words, her handwriting. A stranger's phone. The room tilted. My throat tightened. It was as if the universe had printed my guilt onto glass. I wanted to throw the phone across the room. Instead, I placed it down gently, as though it were a relic, not evidence. When Lydia stirred awake, I pretended to be asleep. It's strange, the kinds of silences we protect. Some to avoid hurting others. Most to avoid recognizing ourselves. The more I tried to bury the truth, the more it clawed its way back up. During interviews, I'd stumble over questions I'd once answered effortlessly. "Was this story inspired by your wife's journals?" I'd laugh softly, rehearsed, and say, "Inspired, yes, but everything I wrote came from experience." Experience. What a convenient word for theft. Sometimes I'd see my reflection on the black lens of a camera mid-interview and barely recognize myself. I'd become two people, the grieving husband on screen and the thief behind the curtain, directing his own confession. Even the house began to feel like a museum of lies. The cedar box, her diaries, now sat in my study, dust gathering like judgment. I'd pass it every morning and feel the air shift, as though it exhaled disappointment. I told myself I'd never open it again, but guilt is magnetic, and the truth, once stolen, keeps calling your name. My students noticed before I did. "Professor Reese," one of them said after class, "you don't talk about writing anymore. You talk about regret." I smiled, told him regret was the foundation of literature. He nodded, not realizing how literal I was being. Soon I stopped teaching altogether. Officially, it was a leave of absence. Privately, it was collapse in slow motion. The publisher sent me on a European press tour, Paris, Rome, Berlin. Each stop felt more surreal. Cameras followed me, microphones hovered near my lips. People cried as I read lines I hadn't written. They called me the prophet of loss. I let them, because what else was left to be? One night in Paris, after a reading, a young woman approached the signing table. She was trembling, clutching her copy of The Silent Sky. Her eyes were wet. "Your book made me forgive my husband before he died," she said. Her sincerity hit harder than any accusation could. I thanked her, smiled, and signed the book. Without thinking, I added a flourish. C-R-E, Claire Reese Elliot. Her name and mine, together. A confession hiding in plain sight. As she walked away, I felt something crack. Small, almost inaudible. The sound a mask makes before it splits. That night, on my walk back to the hotel, the Paris rain felt like penance. The streets glowed with reflections, shop lights, tail lights, the shimmer of 1,000 eyes that didn't know they were watching a fraud. In a bookstore window, I saw my own face on a poster. Above it, the word authenticity. I stood there for a long time, staring at that word. Authenticity, the currency of my career, the disguise of my deceit. I touched the glass, half expecting my reflection to flinch. It didn't, because liars, once perfected, don't even see lies anymore. They see narrative. The next morning, Lydia called. She'd written an article. Elliot Reese, the man who made grief a language everyone can speak. It went viral. My publisher sent flowers. My agent left a voicemail saying, "You're immortal now, Elliot." But when I read the piece, one line froze me. His late wife once wrote in her private journal that he looked at the world as if trying to translate its silence. My blood went cold. That was Claire's line, word for word. A sentence she'd written in a diary no one but me should have seen. How could Lydia have known? I tore through my luggage, through my laptop folders, through every drawer in the hotel room. Nothing. Then it hit me. The documentary crew. A month earlier, a production company had filmed a segment in my study. They'd asked for atmospheric shots of my workspace. I'd said yes. The cedar box had been visible in the background. The cameras had panned slowly across it, the light glinting off the leather covers. My secret hadn't been stolen. I'd given it away. At first, the scandal didn't explode. It simmered. A few online forums noticed similarities between The Silent Sky and entries from Claire's old blog. Someone posted side-by-side screenshots, sentences, handwriting, timestamps. Then a journalist published a piece titled, "Who Really Wrote Elliot Reese's Grief?" Janine called me in a panic. "Don't engage," she said. "This'll pass." People love to tear down success. I wanted to believe her. But truth doesn't pass. It waits. Within days, the story spread like wildfire. Headlines changed overnight. Beloved author of Healing or thief of a dead woman's voice? The diaries behind the bestseller. A widow's words, a husband's fame. Every email, every call, every notification was another crack in the glass. I turned off my phone, locked the door, drew the curtains. But silence isn't protection. It's an invitation for the truth to echo louder. Then came the television exposé. They showed images of her handwriting. They played clips of me reading her words aloud. The anchor's voice was almost tender when she said, "It appears the acclaimed works of Elliot Reese may, in fact, belong to his late wife, Claire Reese." I watched it alone in a hotel room. The TV's reflection flickered across the window, superimposing my face onto the Paris skyline. My name scrolled across the bottom of the screen beside one word: plagiarism. And then, applause. The studio audience clapped for the revelation, for justice, for truth. That was the sound that broke me. Not the accusation, not the loss of career, but the applause. The same rhythm that had once kept me alive. It was as if the world was finally clapping for the right person. Not me. Her. The next day, my agent dropped me. Janine resigned. My publisher recalled the book's pending review. My university terminated my tenure. And Lydia disappeared without a word. Her last message was an apology I never answered. Through it all, Nora stayed silent. I deserved that. Silence this time was justice. The night everything collapsed, I sat by the hotel window and watched the city blink through the rain. I imagined Claire somewhere beyond it all, not vengeful, just watching. I whispered into the glass, "You wanted the world to read her, Elliot. Now they will." Then I laughed, that hollow kind of laugh that sounds too much like crying. Because somewhere inside it, I finally understood. The truth doesn't destroy you. It simply removes everything that isn't real. They say redemption begins when the noise ends. But silence is not forgiveness. It's maintenance. The slow repair of what guilt dismantled. After the storm, my name became a punchline. Bookstores pulled the silent sky from their windows. The university erased my profile from its website. My awards, once gleaming, gathered dust in a box beside the same cedar chest I'd once worshipped. Everything that once made me visible vanished. And for the first time in years, I could finally see myself. I moved out of our old house, the one that had started to feel like a mausoleum of lies. I found a small apartment on the edge of town, above a florist. The air there always smelled faintly of soil and cut stems, like something halfway between decay and renewal. I liked that. It matched me. One morning, I walked past the public library, a modest, aging building with ivy creeping along its bricks. A sign out front read, "Volunteers needed, cataloging assistance." I stepped inside. The head librarian, Mrs. Harlan, recognized me. Her smile was cautious, kind in a way that didn't require belief. She didn't mention the scandal. She only said, "We could use an extra pair of hands." That was 2 years ago. Now, I unlock the library doors before sunrise. The air inside is cool and dry, filled with the smell of paper, dust, and faint electricity. There's a sound I've grown to love, the soft clack of the return slot, books sliding home, as if the world is still capable of gentle returns. I shelve, sort, label, mend. It's simple work, honest in ways writing never was. Some mornings, when the light filters through the high windows and hits the floating dust just right, it looks like snow frozen mid-fall. That's when I think of Claire. She once wrote, "Stillness is just motion we haven't learned to see." I used to quote that line in interviews, pretending it was my own. Now I whisper it like a prayer. Sometimes people still recognize me. Not often, Mostly older readers, ones who hesitate before saying my name, unsure if it's polite to remember. A few bring up The Silent Sky. They say it meant something to them. I never know what to say, so I tell the truth. It wasn't mine to give, but I'm glad it helped you. They usually don't understand, but that's okay. Not all confessions are meant to be received. Nora visits sometimes. Not regularly, maybe once every few months. She never calls ahead, she just appears, walking through the aisles in quiet rhythm, her fingers brushing the spines like she's reading through touch alone. She sits by the window where her mother used to read. We don't talk much, but presence, I've learned, can say everything language once failed to. One afternoon, she brought a notebook. She caught me glancing and smiled faintly. "Are you writing?" I asked. "Trying," she said. That word, trying, felt sacred. It was the word I'd forgotten to honor all those years ago. Trying means beginning again without needing to win. When she left, I found a folded paper tucked into my coat pocket. On it, in her handwriting, "You were never the only thief." I stole her too, every time I called her mine. I sat there for a long time, holding the note until the edges frayed. Then I slipped it between the pages of The Silent Sky. For the first time, that book didn't feel like evidence. It felt like an artifact, a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. At night, when the library closes, I write letters. Not novels, not stories, just letters. To no one in particular. To Claire, to my students, to the man I used to be. I never send them. I burn them in the fireplace and watch the smoke rise into the dark. The flames lick the edges of the paper, curling them like regret learning to exhale. The smoke drifts upward, and I imagine it translating back into air, grief returning to the element it came from. One letter began, "I used to write for the world. Now I write to understand why it wanted me." Another ended, "Some debts can't be paid, only carried with care." That line stayed with me. I wrote it on a scrap of cardboard and pinned it to my desk. When visitors ask what it means, I tell them, it means forgiveness isn't a transaction. It's a posture. Every spring, the library hosts a community reading night. Mrs. Harlan insists I participate. I always refuse, until this year. The room was small, filled with folding chairs and the gentle murmur of neighbors. I stood at the front, a single sheet trembling in my hand. My palms were damp. My heart had the same uneven rhythm it did the night of my first reading. Only this time, the tremor wasn't guilt. It was gratitude. "I don't write fiction anymore," I told them, "but I'd like to share something true." And I read a passage from one of Claire's diaries. Not one I'd ever published, just a quiet entry dated 3 months before she died. "Love isn't what we say to the world. It's what we keep safe from it." When I finished, no one clapped. They didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was whole, like music finally resolving its last note. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. A boy in the back nodded slowly. I didn't thank them. I didn't bow. I just sat down, my hands steady for the first time in years. After the event, a student approached me, a girl with ink-stained fingers and a nervous smile. She said, "I didn't know who you were until tonight, but I think I understand now." I asked, "What is it you understand?" She thought for a moment, then said, "That stories don't save us. They remind us we can still be saved." I smiled, not because I agreed, but because I'd finally met someone who understood the difference. Sometimes, late at night, I walk past the old house, the one Claire and I shared, the one where I first opened the diaries. A family lives there now. Through the windows, I see warm light, hear laughter, smell dinner in the air. The piano still stands by the front window. Someone's daughter is learning scales, her hesitant notes echoing across the street like a beginner's prayer. I stand across the road and listen, not with envy, but with gratitude. For sound, for time, for the ordinary beauty of a life unrecorded. When I turn to leave, I whisper into the wind, "Thank you for the words I never deserved." And if I listen closely enough, I can almost hear her reply. Not angry, not sorrowful, just amused, forgiving, inevitable. Then finally you understand how to write. Every autograph I sign now, the rare ones people still ask for, bears only 3 letters, C-R-E. Claire, Reese Elliot. The truth, finally in order. And that's enough.